Jake had always loved the solitude of his ranch. For years, it had been his safe haven, a place where he could escape from the noise and stress of the outside world. The wide open fields, the peaceful sounds of nature, and the endless skies, this was where he felt truly at peace. He spent his days working the land, tending to the cattle, and enjoying the quiet rhythm of rural life. There was something about the ranch that grounded him, made him forget about the chaos and demands of modern life. But this morning, something was different. As Jake mounted his horse and set out across the property to check on the cattle, the air was thick with an unfamiliar tension. The usual calm he felt in the early morning hours was replaced by a nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach. The day was overcast, and the sky seemed unusually heavy, as if it were waiting for something to happen. Jake pushed the feeling aside, telling himself it was just the weather, but he couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. As he rode along the far edge of the property, something caught his eye, a strange line cutting across the landscape. It was subtle at first, just a faint disruption in the grass, but as he drew closer, it became clearer. There, running through his land, was a thick, metal pipe, buried just beneath the surface of the ground. His heart skipped a beat. He had spent years on this land, walking its miles of open fields, and yet, this pipe was something he had never noticed before. It wasn't a natural feature. Someone had placed it there. As he dismounted and approached the pipe, Jake's anger started to rise. The pipe ran straight across his property, cutting through the fields in a way that seemed deliberate. It wasn't a small issue, like a forgotten irrigation line or an old water pipe. This was something else entirely. This was a pipeline. Jake crouched down, inspecting the earth around it. It was buried just beneath the surface, and it looked like it had been there for a while. The edges of the pipe were slightly rusted, suggesting it had been in place for some time. His mind raced. Who would do this? How long had they been operating under his nose? And, most importantly, why hadn't he noticed it before? He thought back to the previous weeks. He had walked this area numerous times. It seemed impossible that such a large structure had gone unnoticed. But there it was, stretching across his land, and Jake had no idea how it got there or who had put it there. His heart began to pound in his chest. Whoever had done this had to have known what they were doing. They had gone to great lengths to hide it, burying it beneath the surface so that it blended in with the land. But it didn't blend in to Jake. No, it stood out like a glaring mistake, like an insult to everything he had worked for. He could feel the anger rising in his chest as he traced the pipe along the edge of his property, following its path. The pipeline ran for several hundred yards before disappearing into the trees. Jake didn't hesitate. He mounted his horse again and rode along the trail, following the line of the pipe as it stretched further into his land. The deeper he rode, the more questions flooded his mind. Who had the right to do this? Why hadn't anyone mentioned it to him? And what were they doing with the water they were taking? The trail led him to a clearing near the edge of his property, where he could see the unmistakable signs of activity: digging, construction, and a large metal tank set up just beyond the trees. As Jake approached, he felt his blood run cold. This was no small operation. This was industrial. There were pipes, tanks, and equipment scattered throughout the area, all set up in a way that suggested a large-scale operation. It wasn't just some minor water diversion. It was an entire pipeline system, and it had been running across his property without his knowledge or permission. Jake's mind raced as he tried to process what he was seeing. The equipment was clearly new: shiny metal pipes, freshly dug earth, and large tanks that appeared to be holding water. His initial shock gave way to a wave of anger. Whoever was behind this was stealing from him. They were taking his resources without asking. They had built a pipeline across his land, and they were using it for something Jake hadn't figured out yet. But he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't an oversight. Someone had done this on purpose, and they had done it with the intention of getting away with it. Jake felt his fists clench as he looked around the clearing, trying to gather his thoughts. He needed answers. He needed to know who was responsible and why they thought they had the right to take water from his property. Without wasting any more time, Jake turned his horse and headed back to the ranch house, his mind spinning. He had to confront this head-on. There was no way he was going to let someone take what was rightfully his. As soon as he arrived back at the house, he started making phone calls. He called his lawyer first, explaining what he had discovered. His lawyer's response was immediate. "Jake, this is serious. You need to get someone out there to inspect the pipeline. If they've been taking water from your land without permission, that's theft. You need to document everything." Jake's stomach turned as the weight of the situation sank in. Theft. That's what this was. Whoever had done this had stolen from him, and they had done it under his nose. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. No one, not even the HOA, had the right to take his resources without his consent. The next call was to the local authorities. He needed to report this, make sure they were aware of what had been done. But as he called the sheriff's department, Jake realized something else. This was bigger than he thought. Whoever was behind this had the resources to cover their tracks, to hide their operation so well that Jake hadn't even known about it. And that meant they had to be stopped. Jake wasn't sure who was behind this or why they thought they could get away with it. But he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let them get away with it. The pipeline had to be shut down. And if the people behind it thought they could take advantage of him, they were about to learn that they had made a serious mistake. That Jake's mind was racing as he made his way back to the ranch house. His heart pounded in his chest, and anger flared in his veins. As he stepped through the door, he slammed it behind him, locking it. The cold air from outside still lingered on his clothes, but it was the storm inside him that was hard to shake. The discovery of the illegal pipeline wasn't just a violation of his land. It was a violation of his trust, his property, his right to privacy. Whoever had built that pipeline had done so with clear intent, and it was time for him to find out who was behind it. He couldn't waste any more time trying to piece things together alone. It was time to go straight to the source. His first stop was the HOA office. Karen, the HOA president, was the obvious person to confront. Jake had never trusted her. Her strict, overbearing attitude had been a thorn in his side since he'd first moved to the area. She had always been the kind of person who thought her word was law, her decisions final. But this time, Jake wasn't about to let her get away with it. The nerve of her, to think she could just build a pipeline across his property, taking resources without his knowledge or permission. It was beyond unacceptable. As Jake drove toward the HOA office, the anger inside him burned brighter. He had no idea what he was walking into, but he knew one thing: he wasn't going to leave until he got answers. He parked his truck in the small lot outside the office, and as he stepped out, he saw Karen's familiar car sitting there, parked close to the entrance. She was inside, no doubt preparing for another meeting or plotting how to control the neighborhood's next move. Jake's hands balled into fists at his sides as he walked toward the door. This wasn't a simple visit. He wasn't just going to talk things over with her like some polite neighbor. He was done with the HOA's nonsense, and this time, he was going to make sure Karen knew it. He walked through the front door of the HOA office, the familiar bell above the door jingling as he entered. The small room was quiet, the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead filling the otherwise still air. Karen was sitting at the desk, her back to him as she rifled through a stack of papers. She didn't even notice him enter. "Karen," Jake said, his voice firm but controlled, though there was no mistaking the heat behind it. She didn't respond immediately. Karen, always so composed, took her time before turning in her chair, her eyes narrowing as she finally looked up at him. "What is it, Jake?" she asked, her voice cool and distant, though Jake could see a flicker of concern in her eyes. "I think we need to talk," Jake said, walking toward her desk and stopping just in front of it. "I'm not sure what you think you're doing, but I'm done with your games." Karen's brow furrowed. "Games? What are you talking about?" she asked, clearly trying to act like she didn't know what he was referring to. "I'm talking about the illegal pipeline running across my land," Jake said, his voice rising slightly. "I know you're behind it. You think you can just take what doesn't belong to you without permission." The moment the words left his mouth, Karen's face froze. She had been expecting a complaint about something trivial, some small violation of the HOA rules. But this was different. Jake could see the wheels turning in her head, her mind trying to process how much he knew. "I don't know what you're talking about," Karen said, her voice wavering slightly, though she tried to keep her composure. "There's no pipeline running across your land." "Don't lie to me, Karen," Jake snapped. "I saw it with my own eyes. A pipe running right through my property, buried just beneath the surface. And I know it's not just for irrigation or some small project. This is a major operation. Who else would have the resources to set something like that up?" Karen's eyes darted toward the papers on her desk, her fingers nervously tapping the surface. She wasn't expecting this confrontation to happen so quickly, and she definitely wasn't ready to face Jake's accusations head-on. "You're mistaken," she said, her voice growing more defensive. "That pipeline is for a community project. It's for the HOA's water system. We've been working on it for months. You should have been informed about it." Jake didn't buy it. "I've lived here for years, Karen," he said, his voice now steely and determined. "And I've never once heard about this project. If this is such a community project, why wasn't I consulted? Why wasn't I notified? Why was a pipeline laid across my land without my permission?" Karen shifted in her chair, clearly uncomfortable now. She had always prided herself on being in control, but now, she could feel the power slipping from her grasp. "The HOA has the right to make decisions for the betterment of the community," she said, her tone growing more defensive. "And we've been working on this for everyone's benefit. It's a small issue. You're overreacting." "Overreacting?" Jake said, his voice thick with frustration. "You're stealing water from my land, Karen. That's not a small issue. You're taking something that doesn't belong to you, and you think you can just brush it off as nothing." Karen's jaw tightened, her eyes flickering with anger. She wasn't used to being challenged like this, especially not by someone she thought was beneath her. "I'm the president of the HOA, Jake," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I make the rules around here. If you think you can just come in and cause trouble, you're wrong." Jake's patience snapped. "You don't make the rules for everyone, Karen. You're not above the law." He leaned in closer to her desk, his voice low and intense. "You've built an illegal pipeline across my property, and I'm not going to let you get away with it. I'll do whatever it takes to shut it down, and I'll make sure everyone knows what you've been doing." Karen's face turned red with anger, but she didn't back down. "You think you can stop me?" she asked, her voice dripping with contempt. "You think you can take on the HOA and win?" Jake straightened up, his eyes narrowing. "I don't care who you are, Karen. I'm not afraid of you, and I'm not afraid of your so-called HOA. I'll take this to court if I have to. I'll make sure everyone knows what you're doing." Karen stared at him for a long moment, trying to figure out how to regain control. She had always been the one in charge, but now, Jake had flipped the script. He wasn't backing down, and that made her realize something. This wasn't going to be as easy as she thought. "Fine," Karen said, her voice hardening. "If you want to fight, then we'll fight. But don't think you'll win." Jake gave her a cold smile. "We'll see about that." With that, he turned and walked out of the office, leaving Karen behind, seething with anger. The confrontation was just beginning, and Jake knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let her win this time. Jake's mind raced as he left the HOA office, his thoughts swirling with anger and determination. Karen's smug, dismissive attitude had only fueled the fire inside him. She had blatantly denied the reality of what was happening on his property, and now, she was trying to make him feel like he was the one in the wrong. But Jake knew the truth, and it was time to take action. The pipeline was still there, stretching across his land, and Karen's claims of a community project were nothing more than a thinly veiled excuse. This was theft. Plain and simple. Jake knew that if he was going to win this fight, he needed to do more than just make noise. He needed to fight back strategically. The first step was getting legal help. He wasn't going to let Karen and the HOA walk all over him, and he knew that taking the issue to court was the only way to put an end to it. But this wasn't going to be easy. He had to be prepared for the long haul, and he had to be ready for the kind of fight that would drain him emotionally, mentally, and financially. But Jake wasn't afraid. He had spent his life fighting for what was right, and this was no different. He wasn't going to let Karen steal from him, not when he had worked so hard to build everything he had. The next few days were filled with a flurry of activity. Jake reached out to several lawyers, explaining his situation and asking for advice. He needed someone who understood property law and could help him navigate the complexities of the case. He was referred to a seasoned attorney, Frank Hamilton, who had experience with land disputes and cases involving illegal property use. Frank was a no-nonsense type of guy, and from the moment they met, Jake felt confident that he was in good hands. Frank listened carefully as Jake explained everything: how he had discovered the pipeline, how it had been built without his permission, and how Karen and the HOA had refused to take responsibility for it. "This is a clear-cut case of trespassing and theft," Frank said after a long pause. "The HOA has no right to build a pipeline on your property, let alone steal water from it. We can definitely pursue legal action, but it's going to take some time." Jake nodded. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was willing to fight. Frank laid out the steps they would take: gathering evidence, filing the lawsuit, and preparing for a long, drawn-out legal battle. But it wasn't just about winning the case. It was about sending a message to Karen and the HOA that they couldn't get away with treating people like this. As Jake sat in Frank's office, he couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he was finally taking control. But there was also a sense of unease gnawing at him. Karen wasn't going to back down easily, and the HOA was a powerful force. They had money, resources, and influence. They weren't going to let Jake's lawsuit go without a fight. And Jake knew that the more he dug into this, the more complicated it would get. But he wasn't going to be intimidated. He was determined to see this through to the end. Over the next few weeks, Jake and Frank worked tirelessly to prepare their case. They collected evidence, spoke to witnesses, and began to piece together the full scope of the HOA's illegal actions. It became clear that this wasn't just a one-time mistake. It was part of a larger pattern of abuse. The HOA had been building unauthorized pipelines, diverting water from private properties, and hiding their tracks for years. The more Jake learned, the angrier he became. The HOA had been getting away with this for far too long, and now, it was time to hold them accountable. But as they prepared for the legal battle, Jake noticed something unsettling. Karen was no longer staying quiet. She had started reaching out to people in the neighborhood, spreading rumors and trying to turn them against Jake. She made phone calls to local businesses, trying to convince them that Jake was causing unnecessary problems, that he was a troublemaker trying to disrupt the community. At first, Jake tried to ignore it, but it soon became clear that Karen was playing dirty. She was trying to paint him as the villain, to manipulate public opinion before the case even went to trial. He couldn't let that happen. He couldn't let Karen turn the community against him. So, Jake made his own move. He reached out to his neighbors, explaining the situation and showing them the evidence he had gathered. He made sure they knew the truth, that the HOA had illegally run a pipeline across his property without permission, and that he was simply fighting for what was right. As Jake spoke to more people, he realized something important. He wasn't alone. There were others in the neighborhood who had dealt with Karen's manipulative tactics, who had been too afraid to speak up. Now, they were rallying behind him, ready to stand together against the HOA. It wasn't just about the pipeline anymore. It was about fighting back against a corrupt system that had been using power and fear to control the community for far too long. But the fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the days passed, Jake could feel the weight of the case settling in. He had started something big, something that could change the entire dynamic of the neighborhood. But it was going to be a long and grueling process. He knew there would be more twists and turns ahead, more hurdles to overcome. But one thing was certain: he wasn't going to give up. He had a new fire in his heart, a new sense of purpose. The legal battle was just beginning, and Karen and the HOA had no idea what they were up against. Jake wasn't just fighting for his property anymore. He was fighting for the future of the entire neighborhood. And he wasn't going to stop until justice was served. Jake couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest. Despite the progress he'd made in building his case, there was a growing sense of dread gnawing at him. The community support he had garnered was encouraging, but Jake knew Karen wasn't the type to go down without a fight. She was dangerous when cornered, and it was clear that this legal battle wasn't just about property rights anymore. It was about power. He could feel her watching him, her eyes always lurking in the background, waiting for the right moment to strike back. And Jake knew, deep down, that Karen wouldn't just accept defeat quietly. After his visit to the HOA office, he had hoped that Karen's arrogant attitude would wane, but that wasn't the case. The more he dug into the illegal pipeline, the more Karen seemed determined to keep it running, and the more personal things had become. It wasn't just about the water anymore. She had taken this fight personally. She had begun to spread rumors throughout the neighborhood, trying to turn people against him. She'd been using her influence, telling neighbors that Jake was causing unnecessary trouble and disrupting the peace. Jake had even heard whispers that Karen was contacting local businesses, trying to turn them against him too, claiming that his lawsuit was just another example of him making life difficult for everyone. The worst part was, it seemed to be working. Some of the neighbors were starting to pull back, unsure of whose side they should take. The quiet whispers were getting louder, and Jake could feel the pressure mounting. People didn't want to get caught in the middle of a fight between two powerful forces, the HOA and him. As the days went on, the atmosphere around Jake's ranch began to change. Neighbors who had once greeted him with a friendly wave were now avoiding eye contact. Some even went as far as to look the other way when he passed by. It was clear that Karen's campaign was having an effect. The isolation was getting to him, but Jake wasn't going to back down. He couldn't. The truth was on his side, and he wasn't going to let Karen manipulate the community into thinking otherwise. Still, the rumors and whispers weren't the only thing he had to worry about. Karen had gone silent on the legal front, which made Jake even more suspicious. He knew she wasn't done yet. She was waiting for the right moment to hit him where it would hurt the most. It was then that the first real threat came. Jake was sitting in his study late one evening, poring over the legal documents when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number. Frowning, he picked up. "Jake?" The voice on the other end was muffled but unmistakable. Karen's voice. "What do you want, Karen?" Jake replied, his voice colder than he intended. He could already feel the tension building. "I think it's time we have a little chat, don't you?" Karen said, her tone oozing with thinly veiled menace. "You think you can just throw around lawsuits and disrupt things for everyone? You think you can take everything from me?" Jake's stomach tightened. He could hear the anger in her voice, but it wasn't just anger. There was something more. A threat. "This is about more than just the pipeline now, Jake. You've made a mistake, and you're going to regret it." Jake felt his blood run cold. He knew what she meant. This wasn't just about the land, or the water, or the lawsuit. This was personal. "What are you threatening me with, Karen?" he asked, keeping his voice steady, though his mind was racing. Karen didn't respond immediately. Instead, there was a long pause, and Jake could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. Then, in a voice low and full of malice, she said, "You don't know what I'm capable of, Jake. You're just one man, and I have the whole HOA behind me. Don't think for a second that you can take me down without consequences." The line went silent, and Jake stared at his phone in disbelief. This wasn't just a power play anymore. This was a warning. She was willing to do whatever it took to win, and Jake was beginning to realize that Karen wasn't just playing by the rules. She was willing to break them entirely. His mind raced as he processed what she had just said. He wasn't sure what she meant by consequences, but he wasn't going to sit back and wait to find out. Jake had always been a calm, logical man, but he knew he couldn't afford to be passive anymore. Karen had crossed a line, and now, she was making it clear that she wasn't going to let this go without retaliation. As the days passed, Jake kept his eyes open, watching for any signs of further threats. He started getting strange messages, anonymous texts warning him to drop the case or stay out of it. One of the messages even included a picture of his ranch, taken from a distance, as though someone was watching him. It was clear that Karen had mobilized her resources. She wasn't just making empty threats anymore. She had an army of people working for her, and she wasn't afraid to use them. But Jake wasn't going to give in. He had already fought too hard to back down now. He knew the stakes were high. If he let Karen get away with this, she would just keep pushing. He would never have peace, and she would continue to bully everyone in the neighborhood, including him. Jake knew what he had to do. The first step was to secure his ranch, to make sure no one would be able to take advantage of him again. He increased security, installed cameras, and made sure everything was documented, every message, every phone call. He wasn't going to give Karen a chance to make him feel like a victim. The next step was the legal battle. He wasn't going to back down, even if Karen tried to play dirty. He was ready for whatever she threw at him. It was clear that she wasn't going to give up without a fight, but Jake was determined to take her down. If Karen thought she could intimidate him into giving up, she was about to learn a harsh lesson. Jake wasn't afraid of her, and he wasn't going to let her win. The constant threats, the whispers, the unsettling feeling that came with every anonymous message and phone call. It all finally reached a boiling point for Jake. As he sat alone in his study late one evening, staring at the legal documents spread across his desk, the weight of the situation was starting to feel suffocating. Karen had made it clear that she wasn't backing down, but Jake was no stranger to adversity. This wasn't just about a pipeline anymore. It was about standing his ground and reclaiming what was rightfully his. He couldn't let Karen continue to run roughshod over him and the entire neighborhood. He had to take control. The phone rang, breaking Jake from his thoughts. It was Frank Hamilton, his lawyer, the one person who had been by his side through every step of the legal battle. Jake picked up the phone, knowing exactly what the call was about. "Jake," Frank's voice crackled through the receiver. "I've been looking over the case. It's time to take things to the next level. We've gathered enough evidence, and it's clear what the HOA has been up to. It's time to hit them where it hurts." Jake's pulse quickened. This was the moment he'd been waiting for, the moment he took the offensive. "What do we need to do?" he asked, his voice steady despite the intensity of the situation. Frank didn't hesitate. "We're filing a lawsuit. We'll go after the HOA for everything they've done, from the illegal pipeline to the harassment. But more importantly, we're going to demand they take full responsibility for the damages and the theft of your water. It's time to make them pay." Jake could hear the fire in Frank's voice. He knew that this was it, the turning point. "Let's do it," Jake said, determination settling into his bones. "We fight back now." The next few days were a blur of legal paperwork, frantic meetings, and a growing sense of anticipation. Jake knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The HOA had deep pockets, and Karen wasn't the type to roll over without a fight. But Jake had learned that when someone pushes you to your limit, the only thing to do is push back even harder. He had the evidence, the community's support, and now, he had the legal muscle behind him. It was time to put an end to Karen's reign of control. On the morning they filed the lawsuit, Jake stood outside the courthouse, his heart pounding in his chest. The air was cold, but he didn't feel it. All he could think about was the battle ahead, the uphill fight that he knew would test his resolve. But he wasn't alone. His son, Agent Matthews, stood beside him, a steady presence that reminded Jake that family, honor, and standing up for what's right were worth any fight. The paperwork was filed, the lawsuit officially lodged, and now the HOA had to answer for what they had done. Jake's phone buzzed almost immediately after. It was Frank, calling to confirm that they'd be proceeding with the case and that the HOA had been served notice. The tension was thick, but Jake felt something inside him shift. For the first time, he had taken control. No more would Karen be able to push him around, to use her position for her own gain. No more would she be allowed to steal from him or anyone else. The tables had turned, and Jake wasn't about to let them slip back. But he knew Karen wasn't going to let this go quietly. No, she would retaliate, and Jake had to be ready for whatever she threw his way. The first sign came the next morning. Jake was in the barn, checking on the cattle, when he heard the unmistakable sound of a car pulling up to the ranch. He walked outside, wiping his hands on his jeans, and saw the familiar sight of Karen's red SUV parked in front of his house. He felt his pulse quicken. This was it. Karen was here, and she wasn't going to back down. As she stepped out of the car, Jake could see the anger in her eyes, the same cold, calculated look that had always made him wary of her. She wasn't here for a friendly chat. She was here to remind him who she thought was in charge. "Jake," she called, her voice laced with frustration and venom. "I know what you've done. I know you think you can just take me down with some lawsuit, but you're wrong. I've been doing this for years. You won't win this." Jake stood tall, his chest swelling with confidence. He wasn't intimidated by Karen anymore. He had taken control of the situation, and he wasn't about to let her bully him again. "You're the one who's wrong, Karen," he said calmly. "You think you can just push people around because you're the HOA president? Well, it's over. You've crossed the line, and now it's time to face the consequences." Karen's eyes narrowed, and she took a step closer to him, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, Jake," she said, the threat hanging in the air like a storm cloud. "You think a lawsuit is going to stop me? I'll make sure your ranch is ruined. I'll do whatever it takes to make you regret this." Jake didn't flinch. "I'm not afraid of you, Karen," he said firmly, his voice unwavering. "You don't scare me anymore. This isn't just about a pipeline. This is about you abusing your power and getting away with it. I'm taking you down, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows the truth." Karen stood there, glaring at him, her fists clenched at her sides. For a moment, it looked like she might snap, but then she took a deep breath and straightened up. "You'll regret this," she said through gritted teeth. "You have no idea what you're up against." Jake met her gaze, unshaken. "Maybe, but I'm not backing down. Not this time." With that, Karen turned on her heel and stormed back to her SUV. Jake watched her leave, the anger in her face unmistakable, but it wasn't the anger that worried him. It was the promise of retaliation. He knew that Karen would do whatever it took to win, but Jake was ready. He had the law on his side, the truth on his side, and he had made it clear that he wasn't going to let her get away with it. This battle was far from over, but for the first time, Jake felt like he was finally in control. As Karen's car disappeared down the dirt road, Jake stood on the porch of his ranch, feeling a sense of determination settle into his bones. He had taken the first step. Now, it was time to see it through. The days that followed Jake's confrontation with Karen felt like a whirlwind. As soon as the lawsuit was filed, word began to spread. The HOA's attempts to control every aspect of the neighborhood had been exposed, and people were starting to take notice. Jake had expected resistance from Karen and the HOA, but what surprised him was the way the rest of the community reacted. At first, it had felt like he was alone in this fight, just one man standing against the full force of the HOA's power. But as the days went by, Jake began to realize that the neighborhood wasn't as divided as Karen had hoped. One by one, neighbors began to approach him, each with their own story of how Karen and the HOA had tried to control them. People who had once kept their heads down, avoiding conflict and turning a blind eye to the HOA's overreach, were now stepping forward to support Jake. They had seen enough, and they were ready to fight back. It started with small conversations, whispers behind closed doors and at the local diner. But soon, Jake found that he wasn't the only one angry about the HOA's abuse of power. One afternoon, as Jake was working on the ranch, he heard the sound of a truck pulling up. He didn't recognize the vehicle, but as it stopped, the driver stepped out. It was Carl, one of his neighbors, an older man who had lived on the property next to Jake's for years. Carl had always been the quiet type, someone who kept to himself and avoided getting involved in any drama. Jake had spoken to him a few times over the years, but they had never really formed a close friendship. But now, as Carl approached him, Jake could see something different in his eyes, something that wasn't there before. "Jake," Carl said, his voice steady but with a hint of resolve. "I've been watching what's going on with Karen and the HOA, and I don't like it. What they're doing to you, what they've been doing to everyone, it's wrong." Jake stood up from his work, wiping the sweat from his brow. "I appreciate that, Carl," he said, surprised but grateful. "But I'm not the only one who's been affected. The HOA has been pushing people around for years. It's time we stand up to them. Carl nodded. I agree. I've had enough of their control. They've been messing with me too, trying to tell me how to run my land. But I kept my head down, thought it would blow over. But watching you take a stand, well, it gave me the courage to finally do something about it. Jake smiled. I'm glad to hear that. We're stronger together. Carl's eyes brightened, and he nodded firmly. You're right about that. I've talked to a few other neighbors too, and they're ready to speak up. We can't let Karen and the HOA walk all over us anymore. By the end of the week, the neighborhood was buzzing. More and more people came forward, showing their support for Jake. They were tired of the HOA's overreach, tired of being told how to live their lives, tired of being bullied into submission. It wasn't just about Jake anymore. It was about everyone who had been silenced by the HOA's power. Word got around that Jake was no longer the only one pushing back. People started organizing. Small meetings were held in secret, neighbors gathering to discuss their frustrations, share their stories, and plan their next moves. The HOA had thought they could control the neighborhood with fear, with threats, and with their influence. But now, they were seeing the consequences of their actions. One evening, as Jake sat at his kitchen table, he received a call from Frank Hamilton, his lawyer. Jake, Frank said, his voice urgent. We've just received word that the HOA is trying to buy off a few of your neighbors, trying to keep them quiet. They're offering them money to drop their support for your lawsuit. Jake clenched his jaw. He had known Karen would play dirty, but he hadn't expected her to resort to bribery. How many? Jake asked, his voice tight. A few, Frank replied. But the good news is, it's not working. People are seeing through it. And it's only making them more determined to fight back. Jake felt a surge of pride. It was clear now that the HOA's tactics were backfiring. Their attempts to buy people off only made the community more united. As more neighbors joined the cause, Jake started receiving letters of support from all corners of the area. Some were from people he had never even spoken to, who had felt the weight of Karen's control in the past but had been too afraid to speak out. Now, they were ready to stand with him. As the momentum grew, Jake realized that this wasn't just about taking down the pipeline anymore. It was about changing the entire power structure in the neighborhood. The HOA had taken control for far too long, and now, the community was taking it back. The day finally came when Jake and Frank sat down with the group of neighbors who had rallied behind him. The group was small but growing, and there was a shared sense of purpose among them. This is it, Frank said, addressing the group. We've got the evidence, the support, and the law on our side. Now it's time to put pressure on the HOA. We're going public with everything. This isn't just about one man and one lawsuit. This is about the entire community reclaiming what's ours. The room was filled with nods of agreement, and Jake could see the fire in their eyes. The tension that had filled the neighborhood for so long was beginning to melt away, replaced by the strength of unity. Karen and the HOA had no idea what was coming. As the meeting ended, Jake felt a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time since discovering the pipeline, he felt like he wasn't fighting alone. He had the community behind him, and together, they were unstoppable. The fight wasn't over, far from it, but the tide had turned. The HOA had underestimated the power of the people, and now, it was too late to stop them. Jake stood tall, knowing that the battle ahead would be long and difficult, but he wasn't afraid anymore. He was no longer just defending his land, he was defending the future of his community, and he was willing to fight for it, no matter the cost. The moment of reckoning was fast approaching. Jake could feel it in the pit of his stomach every time he looked out at the ranch, every time he heard whispers of support from the neighbors, and especially when Karen's smirk kept flashing in his mind. The battle wasn't over yet, but they had all come a long way since the first discovery of the illegal pipeline. The community was behind him now, and the pressure on the HOA was growing by the day. Every neighbor that spoke out, every letter that went to the press, every conversation that turned into a quiet but firm stance against Karen and her manipulative tactics was a step closer to victory. But Jake knew, deep down, that Karen would go to any lengths to maintain control. She had lost her edge as the undisputed authority of the neighborhood, and the only thing left for her to do was fight dirty. It wasn't just the legal battle anymore. It had become a fight for her reputation and power. Jake stood outside the courthouse the day they filed the final paperwork for the lawsuit. Frank Hamilton had been working tirelessly, and now, after weeks of gathering evidence and witnessing the HOA's increasingly hostile tactics, they were ready to take it all to trial. Jake could hear the buzz of excitement in the air as the courthouse doors opened. His nerves were a little frayed, but he was determined to make this right for his land, his neighbors, and for everyone who had suffered under Karen's rule. Inside the courthouse, the mood was tense, the air thick with anticipation. As Jake sat in the waiting room with his lawyer, the reality of what they were doing hit him. This wasn't just about a lawsuit. This was the start of a larger movement. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for the future of the entire community. "We're ready," Frank said, breaking Jake's thoughts. "This is it." Jake nodded. "Let's do this." They walked into the courtroom, where the tension in the room was palpable. Jake could already see Karen and a few other members of the HOA sitting at the front, looking stiff and uncomfortable. They knew the walls were closing in. Karen, however, was as composed as ever, her usual icy demeanor barely masking her frustration. Jake couldn't help but feel a surge of satisfaction. She wasn't in control anymore. As the trial proceeded, the evidence was clear. The pipeline was not only illegal, it had been built with the full knowledge and participation of the HOA. Witnesses came forward, all providing statements about the various instances of coercion, intimidation, and illegal water theft. Each testimony seemed to chip away at Karen's confidence, her once powerful facade beginning to crack under the weight of the truth. Jake didn't know how Karen was holding up, but he could tell she was no longer the figure of authority she had once been. The control she had wielded with an iron fist was slipping away. As the case unfolded, Jake watched as Karen's defense crumbled piece by piece. It was clear she had no legitimate defense for the actions of the HOA. Her accusations were baseless, and her attempts to manipulate the court were transparent. At one point, Karen tried to turn the tables by claiming Jake had fabricated evidence and was trying to harm the reputation of the HOA. But the witnesses Jake had lined up were too strong, and the evidence was irrefutable. The trial dragged on for days, but it was clear that the momentum was on Jake's side. The more Karen tried to fight back, the more the walls closed in around her. When the final arguments were made, Jake stood tall, feeling the weight of the moment. He had fought for so long, but it was all coming down to this. "Your Honor," Frank began, his voice steady and confident. "The evidence presented here is undeniable. The HOA has not only trespassed on Mr. Jake's property, but they have engaged in illegal actions, stealing water from his land for their own gain. This was not a mistake. This was intentional. And now, Mr. Jake is demanding justice for the loss he's suffered." Jake could feel his heart pounding as he sat, his eyes never leaving Karen's face. She looked like she was holding it together, but Jake could see the panic creeping into her eyes. She knew the end was near. The judge took a long pause, looking over the evidence once more. The courtroom was silent, every single person waiting for his decision. "I have reviewed the evidence," the judge said, his voice calm but firm. "It is clear that the actions of the HOA were illegal and in violation of Mr. Jake's property rights. Therefore, I am ruling in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Jake. The HOA is ordered to remove the pipeline immediately, and they are to pay restitution for the damages caused. The HOA is also prohibited from further using Mr. Jake's land without his explicit permission." The room erupted in murmurs of disbelief, but Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was over. The courtroom was filled with a mix of emotions. Some of the HOA members looked stunned, others angry, but Jake couldn't bring himself to care. He had won. The judge's ruling was a massive victory, but it was more than that. It was a statement. Jake hadn't just won the case. He had exposed the HOA for what it truly was. A group of people who had used their power to control others, break the law, and bully anyone who stood in their way. As he left the courtroom, Jake could feel the weight of the decision settle in. He was free. His land was free. And Karen's reign was finally over. But there was one more thing to address: the community. Jake knew that the real victory wasn't just the lawsuit. It was the support of the people who had been watching from the sidelines. As he stepped outside the courthouse, the first thing he saw was the crowd of neighbors gathered outside. They had been waiting for the verdict, and now that it was out, they cheered. Jake felt a wave of pride swell in his chest. This wasn't just his victory, it was theirs too. "You did it!" Carl, his neighbor, shouted, slapping Jake on the back. "You took her down." Jake smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in months. "We did it," he corrected. "It's not just me. It's all of us. We've taken back control." The crowd rallied around him, and for the first time, Jake felt a sense of unity among his neighbors. Karen's manipulation had fractured the community for far too long, but now, they were coming together, stronger than ever. As Jake looked at the faces of his neighbors, he knew that this was only the beginning. The HOA was done. Karen was out. And the community had a chance to rebuild itself, free from the fear and manipulation that had held it hostage for so long. The future looked bright, and Jake was ready to help lead the way.